Welcome to Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help you recognise and unlock the entrepreneur skills in your business. This week, imposters, confidence, and running meetings. So to help us with imposter syndrome, I'm really pleased to be interviewing Lindsey Sharratt, who helps high-achieving entrepreneurs smash performance blocks. She's an expert in imposter syndrome. You know, that time when you hear the voice in your head saying, "I can't do that. They'll all see through me. They'll know I'm an imposter." Here's the interesting thing. Many successful people still struggle with feeling inadequate, despite experience showing them otherwise. But before that, time to burst one quick introvert myth. Just after publishing my book, Running Meetings That Make Things Happen, I was asked if I wrote the book because introverts are too quiet to run meetings. I asked around and found that other people thought that too. So this week's myth is just that. Introverts can't run meetings. What rubbish. Into the bin. Running effective meetings is about being organised, listening and allowing people to say their piece so that others listen. Being introverted is a tendency to lose energy in groups of people and need to recharge by being on your own. It's not a block to running meetings. In fact, it's reasonable to say that many introverts are very good at running meetings. They're good at listening, summarising, getting consensus and focusing on action. How many meetings have you been to where those skills would have made a whole big difference? As it happens, the book was written for any leader who runs meetings, especially those meetings with introverts in them. Do let me know what introvert myth you'd like exposed, or what tip you'd like that would help you to activate the entrepreneurial skills in your business. But now, let's get on with this week's interview. Welcome, Lindsey.
Good morning, John.
How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
One of the questions I always ask before we dive into the subject, are you an introvert, an extrovert, and what's the point? What does that mean to you?
So most people are shocked to hear this, but on testing I score 92% introvert. What does it mean to me? I like to recharge by myself. I get no energy at all from being in a room full of people. I massively dislike pointless, random socializing. I'm quite introspective and I dislike a very loud working environment. I work much better in silence and space.
Brilliant. Now, imposter syndrome is something which I'm really interested in because I see a lot of people suffer it, if I can put it like that. And then they tell me that they suffer it because they're introvert. And I just want to strangle them at that point because I think that's complete rubbish. But I'm going to check with you. What's your thought on it?
I agree with you. It's complete rubbish. So I mentored for a lot of years before I got into coaching. I've read endless amounts of psychology research around imposter syndrome, and I've worked with introverts and extroverts. It is not because you're an introvert that you have imposter syndrome, although people sadly are very often told that it's because you're an introvert that you have imposter syndrome. And this is all around the misconceptions that maybe because you're not as quick to jump up and shout about what you do and how good you are at it, that's because you're not actually that confident in what you do. And it's nothing to do with that. Statistically, there's no real difference between the levels of imposter syndrome that I've seen in introverts and extroverts. So no, if we can blow that one out of the water, that would be really good.
Fabulous. So that one's in the bin then. What do you define imposter syndrome as?
I think the most common thing I hear is it's just me. And I see all these people in my field. So I hear it in academia, I hear it in corporate, I hear it in sport. And the underlying theme is it's only me, so I'm not good enough. and people think I'm better than I am, and I'm a big fraud, and one day someone's going to come along and they're going to say, actually, you have all these things that you don't really deserve because you're not good enough, you're not as competent as we thought you were. So it's basically feeling that you've done better than your competence allows you to do.
So where does it come from then? Why does somebody start believing that?
There are all sorts of bases. A lot of it comes from when you're younger. So if you have an insecure sense of self, if you've struggled to achieve when you were younger and feel you can only do it by huge effort, if you've had no reinforcement from your parents and your competence, the wrong sort of reinforcement, it can be chance remarks from a teacher who maybe told you that you weren't very clever or you weren't going to achieve anything. One of the bad things about imposter syndrome is a lot of the times people don't actually remember. They can remember having a sense of unease about themselves and their competence and their confidence, but not exactly where it came from, especially if they were very young. And it can happen later in life as well. So say if you've had, a financial disaster or something that went horribly wrong in your career, or maybe a sporting event that went wrong for you, although you think, oh, I've recovered from that and I've got on, somewhere in your head keeps reminding you that no, this went wrong, and maybe you are a fraud.
So it's a bit like a collection of mental baggage almost, that you might not know where it's come from. You've just picked it all up.
Absolutely.
Which leaves you thinking that you're not good enough to deserve the position you're in. How then do you get over that?
Well, I'm doing a PhD in the background, and the basis of identity research, the way that I'm researching it, is through autobiographical memory. So you have memories of the events that happened to you, some of which you can recall, some of which you can't. Then you have the ones that define to yourself who you are as a person. So the work that I do is very strongly around helping you understand how you define yourself as a person, the things that you think are formative and important, helping people to look at, actually, well, no, I have this degree of evidence to say that actually I am competent, and this thing that I'm blowing up out of proportion is not what I think it is. The view of the person who made me feel that lack of confidence is maybe not as important as I think it is. It's not therapy. I don't do therapy. What I do is help people to draw the line, assess where they are, look at their competencies, understand that actually, no, with where they've got to, they're actually pretty good. And then the imposter syndrome will go away by itself because they've changed how they look at themselves.
So it's about taking a step back and looking at evidence on your performance rather than, if I can put it like this, that the hearsay from somebody that you probably wouldn't even turn to for advice.
But if you could just say to yourself, well, obviously, look at me and what I've achieved, I am good enough, it will go away by itself, and it wouldn't be so rife. I'd say probably 60% of people suffer from imposter syndrome from the figures that I've seen.
So certainly one of those things that where somebody is not the only one, as you said, because I've interviewed lots of introverts who don't even realise they're introverted. They just think that they're the only one that feels like that. And when they realise that they're not, it's like, wow, the weight lifts off their shoulders and they start to perform completely differently.
Absolutely. The point that you were making about introverts and extroverts and imposter syndrome is interesting as well, because I hear all this, imposter syndrome and introverts. Introverts have an advantage in some ways because an extrovert gets their energy from people, has a pressure on them to go out and perform, and okay, they want to do that, but there is a pressure on them to do it, so they have to keep up this persona, especially in the levels of people that I deal with. If you're an introvert, you're usually a lot more introspective. So one, you don't have this push to get yourself out into the limelight all the time, which involves keeping up the imposter syndrome, even if you feel really bad about yourself. And two, you're more likely to have another narrative that's running simultaneously saying, well, yeah, okay, one little voice in my head saying you're not good enough, but actually, when I take away all this stuff that's making me feel bad, I can logically think, as I was saying earlier, yeah, actually, I am good enough. Look at the other things I've done.
It's a really interesting way of twisting it, and I can absolutely see the logic of that one. One thing you mentioned when we were chatting before the show was that introverts can hide it better.
Yeah.
Did I mishear that one?
No, and that surprises a lot of people. This is back to the extrovert. The extrovert will, and I'm using introvert and extrovert quite liberally here, and I just want to remind everybody that it's not a bucket. You are not an introvert or an extrovert. There's a scale of extroversion. So if you score highly on that, you will be called extrovert. If you don't score highly on that, you'll be called introvert. So the higher you get up that scale of extroversion, the more you have the drive to go out, to get your energy up by socializing with people, to be outgoing, to talk about what you do. Introverts hide it better because they haven't got that constant push to put themselves forward. They can be quietly competent in the background. So if you just have to produce the figures that make your boss look absolutely wonderful, if you're doing that quietly in the background, you haven't got the moment where you've got to stand forward and go, look at me, I did that. You do lose out on the credit for it, but you haven't got that massive pressure to stand up and own it.
Lindsey, I think that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. We've gone completely over time because I've just
Sorry.
fallen into the conversation. No, it was incredibly useful and really interesting. One tip would you give to an introvert who wants to improve their performance?
Learn an extrovert persona. You don't have to actually be one, but if you can make yourself step forward just to own the good stuff that you've done occasionally, it will make you get noticed more.
Love it. And if there is a leader who wants to help introverts in their team to perform better, a very quick tip for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Understand all your team members. Some won't put themselves forward. It's your job to do that for them.
That's fantastic. And final question, Lindsey, if some of the listeners want to get back in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
You'll find me on LinkedIn. I'm always quite happy to speak to people, or my website is agamegroup.com.
Fabulous. I'll put the URL on the sleeve notes of the show so people can just click straight onto it.
That's fantastic.
Thank you very much for your time. Really, really good discussion. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Love speaking with you.
And so it's time for the leadership tip of the week. The tip for people that are leading introverts and want to get more from their whole team, introvert, extrovert, and everything in between. Praising people doesn't always boost confidence. Introverts use internal validation a lot more than extroverts, and so many introverts value external validation less than extroverts. Let's put that in English. Praising introverts, of course, is good, but in itself it won't make them think they did a great job. Internal validation means that many introverts have a confidence that comes from an inner strength rather than the external appearance of strength. Having an introverted team member does not mean they lack confidence. But here's an idea you might use to help an introvert be more confident. Support that internal validation. To help an introvert be more confident means helping them validate themselves. Help them to understand what the elements of a great job are, and then help them work out how well they did against those elements. That will allow them to validate themselves internally and really boost their confidence. Of course, you could always recognize self-awareness as well and help them to realize that you know that they're confident, and make sure that you allow for internal processing. As we've said before in this show, introverts tend to process things internally. In other words, you ask a question, they might think about the answer for a second. Don't jump in. But the most important one, support internal validation. Thank you for listening to Activate Your Introvert, and I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I'd love to see your reviews on the iTunes store. Thank you once again, and catch up with you next week.